Hi, everyone. I'm just getting everything set up so that we have Q&A chat available. I think we'll also start the webinar a couple minutes past 11 just to make sure everyone can join if people are still getting off calls. So we'll start momentarily. All right, I think we'll just go ahead and get started and hopefully more people will join when they can. So thanks so much to everyone for joining this webinar today. My name's Katie. I'm a senior legal counsel at TLB. And today we're going to be going through a step-by-step process for how to create a legal user playbook for your most negotiated contracts. So a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. So as I mentioned at the start, we want this session to be really interactive. So you'll see a Q&A function and a chat function available. Please write in ongoing questions for discussion. We're not going to be saving everything towards the end. So if something doesn't sound correct or you're not quite sure what I just said, please feel free to type the question and we can just go through it in real time so that this is really interactive and you get the most out of it. After the webinar, we'll be sharing the slides and the session recording, so you'll have that to reference back if you need. And we'll just spend about 10 minutes at the end to talk about kind of what we do at TLB and how we do playbooks so that potentially we can help support you on your journey as you start creating playbooks for your legal team. All right. So diving into exactly what is a playbook, a playbook provides your legal team with a clear step-by-step guidance to negotiate a contract. I believe a lot of you have actually downloaded our sample contract negotiation playbook, which we provided for free on our website, and it contains a pretty comprehensive Google Sheets setup template or Excel sheet template that you can populate to give you a baseline for what to include in your playbook. But essentially, the playbook that we'll be covering today is going to be, yes, a legal user playbook. We do create and can do step-by-step process for how to create a business user playbook, but we do kind of a different structure, different content for those types of playbooks. This one is going to be very legal focused. All right. And why we recommend that legal teams need one, there's a lot of different benefits, a few set out here. So one, it provides a consistent and standardized negotiation process. So this leads into minimizing the risks of accepting terms that you actually can't. So by having a playbook, you're going to have a really clear guidelines for your legal team so they're not kind of going rogue and accepting something that you actually can't in practice. It also provides a clear escalation path in order to get deals done. So if you need sign off on payment terms, for instance, from the finance team, it will provide the email and who to go to in the finance team in order to get sign off and not delay a deal anymore. It can also act as a training guide for junior legal team members. So it provides really clear and comprehensive guidance over exactly what your organization's risk appetite is, how you communicate with counterparties, your preferred tone of voice, that sort of thing. It also enables the legal team to share risks with the business, which is a definite win. The fallback positions that you include in a playbook should be confirmed and accepted by the business teams. So you're not going to be agreeing to termination rights that the business team is unaware of. So it allows you to just get your deals done faster and not have to escalate to them on a case-by-case basis so often. This also relates to gaining efficiencies by not needing to reinvent the wheel every time. We always include really robust explanations to the counterparty in our playbooks. And by having something that you can just copy and paste and, tweak as needed it's real time saver when it comes to negotiating a long contract, and doesn't require you to get into that creative writing space, and you can just kind of copy and paste and go. And then lastly, it provides you the ability to monitor and continuously improve performance of your preferred positions. So the playbook is a great tool to be able to see what you can and can't accept. But if you find that you're routinely agreeing to something that deviates from your playbook, whether it's your default position or a fallback position, it can be kind of a good reminder to revisit the playbook in the future and think, okay, maybe we actually can accept something a bit riskier for this particular term because we keep agreeing to it in every single contract. So it's a good way to just kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what your company's risk appetite is. All right. So here is a snapshot of exactly all the steps that we're going to go through in a lot of detail. This makes it seem like creating a playbook is just a snap of a finger, but it is a pretty time-consuming exercise. But essentially, the first step is to identify what contracts take up most of your team's time being negotiated. So this can be either your organization's own template or a third-party paper, or both. So we'll get into kind of the structure for how you can either do, template specific, third-party paper specific, or a combo of the two. So once you figure out what contracts you're looking to set the playbook up for, you need to figure out what terms in those contracts are most frequently negotiated. Playbooks can be pretty comprehensive. Some playbooks I've created are about 150 rows. We want it to be a really useful resource for the legal team, but we also don't want to overload them with information that they really don't need. So a severability boilerplate clause, for instance, never going to be negotiated. So don't bother including it in your playbook. The next bit is going to be a review of your historical sampling of red lines. I'll get into a bit more detail about exactly what that means later on. But you're going to basically take that sampling and assess your company's risk appetite in order to see what your initial and ultimate fallback positions are. And then finally, you're going to create a clear path for escalations for the legal user to know exactly who to go to if, coming back to that payment terms example, if they need to get 15-day payment terms approved by someone in finance, for instance. All right, and then moving on to the playbook structure for what it looks like. As I mentioned, I think most of you have actually downloaded the example playbook we have, which we provided in an Excel sheet, which you can use. Here at TLB, we love Google Sheets, though, because it allows you to really easily collaborate with everyone in your team and other business teams as needed. So if you do use Google Sheets internally, highly recommend. But basically, it's going to be a spreadsheet, bottom line, and it's going to be split out into these different columns. So the section and the specific term, the section is kind of the overarching theme of the clause that you're going to be potentially negotiating. So fees and payment terms, for instance. The specific term is going to be the actual clause within that section that is heavily negotiated. So late payment interest, for instance. You might want 3%, counterparty might want 1%. So you can do step-by-step process for that there. Next, you're going to have your default position. So this is where the template versus counterparty versus combo split comes in. So if you're going to be creating a playbook that's based on your own template, you probably don't need to include this column because the legal user is going to have your contract right in front of them as they're reviewing it and using the playbook. So no need to add more noise to the playbook than it already might contain. But if you're going to be creating a playbook that you want to use negotiating third-party paper, or for an NDA, for instance, if you have a company template, but you also review third-party paper NDAs, you can probably include this position or include this column in your playbook to handle both sets, just because when a user is going to be using the playbook reviewing contract, it's really helpful to have your default position just right there in front of them so that they can keep it top of mind. The next column is going to be the counterparty issues. So this is what the counterparty either deletes or adds or slightly changes in the contract that differs from your default position. The next bit is going to be your initial response to the counterparty. So this is where the negotiability bit comes in. So if you always want to initially push back on changing your default position, you're going to want to include a really robust, detailed, bespoke canned response to the counterparty, explaining why they should just agree to your default position and why you're not going to accept any changes to it. However, you're going to come into your next column, which is going to say the negotiability bit, and this can just be a simple yes or no for whether that clause can ultimately be, whether you can ultimately accept a compromise, or if you need to stay firm on your default position and you can't negotiate that any further. So if you can agree to compromise, the next column is going to set out your internal fallback position. This is just internal guidance for the user to explain what you can and can't accept. So it can be a bit more colloquial, short and to the point, because it's just guidance for the user on what to do next. The accompanying response, however, does need to be tailored to fit your company's preferred communication, preferred comms method and tone of voice with your counterparties. So you want to tailor this response to make sure that if you're negotiating a customer contract, for instance, it's friendly and collaborative, but still firm in your position. But essentially, this response can be copied and pasted as a comment into the red line contract so that you're explaining again to the counterparty why you either can't accept exactly what they're asking for, or again, just need to stay firm on your default position. And then finally, if the counterparty unfortunately continues to push back despite the responses you've provided them, you're going to want to include a point of escalation. So this can be the finance team. We usually recommend doing a group email. So privacy@tlb.law, for instance, rather than someone specific in the team. Just people do, come and go. So it helps to just have the team group email there and exactly the job title of who needs to approve a final deviation. So head of privacy, for instance, head of InfoSec, that sort of thing. All right, so that was kind of a really broad overview of what we're going to be building out today. So we're going to start diving in. Again, if anyone has questions based on what I just said, please use the Q&A and chat function. I have it up so we can kind of have a more lively discussion, hopefully. But in any event, we'll get started with going step by step into exactly what all of this means for building out your playbooks. So step one, identify the most negotiated contracts. So we would first recommend, if you've never built a contract, a playbook before, we recommend starting small because building a really comprehensive and useful playbook can be a very time-consuming exercise, especially depending on the complexity of the agreement and how many playbooks you actually want to create. So if you want to start small, we would recommend starting with an NDA playbook. Again, this playbook can be used for both your organization's own NDA template and counterparty paper so that it can just be used to cover the whole gambit. But essentially an NDA playbook is something that you can do pretty quickly. So yeah, it just gives you a quick win for your legal team. And it can act as the prototype so that you can more easily repeat this exercise later on when you come onto your more complex agreements. So after you've built that prototype, we would recommend doing a discovery session internally to prioritize and plan what playbooks you want to build next. So if your team uses any type of tech tools to track historical hours spent negotiating contracts, that will give you really great insight into which contracts actually warrant a playbook. You don't want to be building out a playbook and spending a lot of time on something that is hardly ever negotiated or is non-negotiable for your company maybe. So, you can include a lot of really good, robust responses, but you might not want to start with something that isn't going to be so widely used. So refer to those data tracking tools, or you can just simply interview your team members who negotiate your contracts on the daily to understand which agreements are most heavily negotiated and which are taking up most of their time. So based on this information, you can then create kind of a playbook roadmap based on order of priority. Certain financial institutions, you can have 800 templates. Smaller startups might just have a few. So depending on how many templates and contracts you work with on the daily and how heavily they're negotiated, that can give you an indication on whether you actually need a whole roadmap or maybe it's just a list of a few playbooks that you want to create. But doing that first step to kind of plan and prioritize is always really helpful, we found. So the next step is going to be identifying the most negotiated terms within that contract that you've identified needs a playbook. So when you're figuring out what terms to include, if the playbook takes into account your own company's templates, you want to put yourself basically in the counterparty's shoes and review your contracts to identify the most controversial terms. I recommend highlighting them to keep track of what you do and don't want to include in your playbook, especially if you have, a 60-page contract that you're trying to build out a playbook for. It's really helpful to just, highlight those rows in the clause so that you can have a holistic view of exactly the content you want to include in your playbook at the end and share that with your team also to see if they agree with your assessment on what's most negotiated and what's not. As I mentioned earlier too, you don't want to include, most boilerplates. Assignment sometimes gets tricky, as does governing law, but any terms that really just aren't worth your time, aren't heavily negotiated, we recommend not including them in a playbook just to make sure that it's extremely practical and useful guidance for the user. So if you don't have a company template that you're working off of, or if you want to do a combo playbook, you also want to review third-party paper to see what was previously negotiated on that paper. So we recommend gathering about 3 to 4 red lines as the sampling and see what you wanted to delete or change in that counterparty paper. Again, highlight those to keep track of what you do and don't want to include in the playbook. Share it with your team to see if those same issues pop up in most agreements that you're negotiating. Maybe you grabbed just accidentally a one-off contract that was negotiated like crazy, and actually in practice, it's no big deal. So definitely collaborate with your team and get their feedback. But that should give you a really good indication of what you want to populate for the section and specific term columns of your playbook with just those high-level titles. So on this next slide, we're going to be building out an example playbook over the course of this webinar. So we'll keep track of our progress through this table. In this example, we're building out a playbook to set out a company's preferred positions for term length and auto renewal for their service provider contracts. So based on the information that I just said, you now can build out that section and specific term columns. All right, so moving on, we're going to be digging into your red lines now. And this is in order to determine what side wants or what each side wants. So You want to populate your default position, obviously, with what you want to see in your contracts. So this is going to be your go-to, what you feel comfortable accepting immediately positions. You can find this either based on the current wording in your own template, or with your redline sampling of counterparty paper that you redlined, you can see what you sought to change and reflect those positions in the column of default position. We also recommend keeping the wording really short and sweet so that it's easy to use. 30 days succinctly describes your preferred payment terms. There's no reason to write a novel around what you need to include for payment terms or anything else really. Obviously, some terms like liability, indemnity, warranties, those can get a bit tricky and obviously warrant a bit more description and length, but where possible, try to keep it as short as possible so that the legal user can just, it's really easy to use for them. So the next bit is going to be what the counterparty wants, and this is going to inform what you want to include in the counterparty issue column. So this information is going to be, again, using your redline sampling and your templates. You're going to see what the original terms contained in the third-party paper's redline sampling was. The original wording that you then marked up on top of it, or amendments that a counterparty made to your own template. So what they wanted to change from your default position. That sampling, the amendments on your own template, again, we recommend about 3 to 4 historic samples to give you a good idea of what's consistently requested. All right. So moving on to where we're at building out this playbook. So using those redline samplings, we're able to build out the default position and the counterparty issue. So this company wants usually 12 months and no auto renewal, but in their service contracts, they generally see the counterparty requesting a term for longer than 12 months and the agreement auto renews. All right. So moving on to the big, most time-consuming portion, I think, of this exercise is going to be assessing your risk appetite. So what you can and can't accept, you're going to figure out based on an analysis of those historic redline samplings. So you want to see what you initially and ultimately accepted that differs from your default positions. Tying it back to what I previously said around the structure, what you initially accepted can help inform what you want to write for your initial response to the counterparty. And what you ultimately accepted will basically inform what you want to include as your fallback position and accompanying response if you are never really able to accept exactly what the counterparty issue is. So hopefully your sampling has a few rounds of back and forth to indicate what you do initially and ultimately accept to create those fallback positions. But we also highly recommend bringing in other functions and leadership teams even to review and sign off on those proposed compromises. Just because you see that you consistently accepted something in your sampling doesn't mean that the company actually wants that as its go-to fallback, and maybe it can't agree to that actually, and has a kind of higher risk appetite or lower, I suppose. So you want to make sure that you're gathering feedback and confirming with the teams who this is really going to impact. Going back to payment terms and finance, they're always a great one. You want to make sure that you're bringing in the finance team to confirm that payment terms you're consistently accepting actually align with what the finance team is operationally set up to accept. So making sure you're looping in others where possible. This also means that you'll have to escalate, hopefully, a lot less to those teams because you have signed off fallbacks that you can just go to without needing to loop in others. But if a particular team, InfoSec, for instance, is really worried about what exactly the legal team is accepting, they can also kind of maintain that control by just saying, look, we really don't have a fallback. I want to review these on a case-by-case basis if the counterparty is making changes. So you can just document that. And over time, maybe you can come up with a fallback position, but at least everyone is on the same page and the business function is, again, sharing that risk with the legal team and being more collaborative in these review of your contracts. So once you have clarity on issues that are low risk and what exactly are showstoppers that need to be escalated, you're going to want to document these by populating your initial response, negotiability, fallback position, and accompanying response columns in your playbook. So this step basically almost gets us to the finish line. So we populated a lot with just that information. So in this example, for the term length, this company is happy to just immediately agree to the fallback position. So they've written none in their initial response and have marked it, yes, this is negotiable. And what they advise is to speak to the stakeholder immediately to check if a longer term is expected, such as if there was a discount in fees that linked to, say, a 3-year term. That just cuts out any back and forth between the legal team trying to just stick hard to, what you thought your usual position is, and instead making sure that the business is aware, like, we know that you've agreed to this commercially, so obviously happy to agree to this. But if no commercial discussions have been agreed to, then this is obviously not negotiable. And then for the auto renewal clause, so this is actually a non-negotiable for this particular company. So we've included an initial response to push back on why this company can't accept agreeing to an auto renewal clause. And whoever the escalation point of contact is, to be continued in the next slide, they have said that they want full visibility over any contracts that we're agreeing to auto renewal. So for that reason, we've marked no in the fallback position and accompanying response. So if we can't get past agreeing to no auto renewal after sharing that initial response with the counterparty, this will need to be escalated. All right. So as I've just said, we're going to need to create that clear path for escalations, especially with the auto renewal clause, because I guarantee the counterparty might push back. So when you're figuring out who can approve deviations, when you're working with other teams to first determine those fallback positions, you can also at that time confirm who they want to nominate as the ultimate point of contact if they need to, if a counterparty continues to push back on your proposals and you need to escalate it. As I mentioned earlier, we recommend including a team email address rather than a specific individual's address, just to ensure it can be used kind of future-proofed. And we also recommend including the title of who ultimately needs to sign off on it rather than just privacy team. So someone that the legal user can specifically go to and know, okay, I've got their sign off, we're good to go. So that wraps up the final piece to populating your playbook, because obviously that will inform your escalation points. So we've written some examples here, but yeah, with all of that, you've now got your full playbook. However, you might not be quite finished yet. There are a few other bits that we do recommend you add on, which you might have actually seen if you downloaded that sample commercial contracts playbook. Before I actually dive into this, so I haven't seen anyone typing any questions, so maybe I'll just pause for a minute if anyone does want to ask about how to set up your playbook, what contracts to do, any questions at all. All right, maybe not. Okay. Well, we'll move on, and obviously there will be time left over at the end. I think we're whizzing through this pretty quickly, so give everyone some time back. So the few other add-ons that we've, oh, actually, sorry, just got a specifics. Do we need specific software? To build out your playbook, no. So as I mentioned, you can do this on Excel. I really recommend Google Sheets because, as I mentioned, you can tag other people in. Go back to this one. You can tag other people in to review what you've proposed as a compromise position, review what you've written for your response to the counterparty, making sure that it aligns with your company's preferred tone of voice. So yeah, Google Sheets is amazing for this type of exercise, but obviously Excel works just as well. So no software needed, just a simple spreadsheet will do the trick. All right, and we have another question here. So we envision a broader handbook that, besides the playbook, also provides guidance and information on more general topics such as products, compliance, etc. Would you advise adding such more general information to the spreadsheet or using a different application to build the broader handbook that links to the playbook spreadsheet? That's a great question. So I would actually advise on doing a separate, broader handbook, kind of a business toolkit that the business stakeholder can use to know where to go to for all information related to getting their deals done. So yeah, if they need to talk to your product team, your compliance team, that sort of thing, I think building out a separate handbook that just has kind of go-to links, email addresses, making that document really, short and to the point, like a one-pager, for instance. And then, yeah, linking out this playbook. I think that would be really helpful for the business. And then I just realized we're talking about a legal user playbook here. So for the legal team, I think you could do the same thing. I think a one-pager that just sets out, just here's what you need to know. Here's the links. Here's points of contact to go to for more questions, that sort of thing. And then here's the playbook that you use to negotiate this contract. I would probably separate it just so that you're not overloading the user with a lot of information in one spot. They can kind of pick and choose what they need to know at that time. So I hope that answered your question. All right. And then are there any other tools than spreadsheets that are viable when creating the playbook? Such as tools that provide advice contextually within the contract. So if you're talking about legal tech tools, there definitely are a lot out there that can kind of build a playbook for you within their own platform. So when you have a contract open in Word, it actually has the playbook working in the background, and it can flag, this doesn't align with your playbook. Here's the canned response to include for them. So there are a lot of tools out there. Definitely feel free to email us separately about that if you want to explore that in more detail, because we have a lot of recommendations around what you can use. But if you want something much more sophisticated, then, because we obviously do appreciate it also is still a pretty manual process to first build out the playbook and then use it. But there are a lot of ways you can automate this process, use technology to make it quicker. So yes, feel free to reach out to us separately and we can talk about that in more detail. All right, I think that's all the questions for the moment. So moving on to a few other add-ons that we recommend including in your playbooks. So the first is going to be just a simple guidance note, kind of a no-brainer, but it really helps to make sure that this tool can be a simple self-serve kind of, here you go, get up and running for more junior members of your team. So it basically can just explain the purpose of the playbook, how to use it, who to go to for questions. Just a short guidance note. The second tab that we recommend adding is a contract thresholds tab to essentially provide a guideline as to what types of contracts should be reviewed against the playbook, depending on their value and importance to the business. So if you're building out the type of contract that we've just done, it can be extremely comprehensive. And although it speeds up the negotiation process, it does still require potentially 1 or 2 rounds of back and forth with the counterparty to get you to a state where you feel comfortable and your positions are being met. So this is a great tool to use for, software contracts, high value contracts, contracts that are processing personal data. But you don't want to use this for a £1,000 stationary supplier contract. There's no reason to negotiate that, and it doesn't warrant the rounds of back and forth with the counterparty. So kind of putting in parameters around exactly when this playbook should be used and when potentially a separate review process should be used for those really low risk, low value contracts, just to ensure, your legal team isn't going to the mat for your pencils. So that'll just prevent unnecessary delays. And then the last bit is going to be an exceptions log. I had also mentioned that playbooks are a really good tool to continuously monitor and see how your positions are evolving over time. So an exceptions log is where you can track and log how many times you actually are agreeing to deviations from your standard positions. And when I mean standard positions, I mean both your default positions and the fallbacks that are already pre-approved. So if you're always going beyond what you can just automatically accept as your fallback, clearly your fallback isn't quite working, and you need to kind of reassess that with your internal business teams and see if your risk appetite is actually a bit higher than what your playbook might lead on. We recommend reviewing this log annually, again, bringing in other functions as needed, and then adapt your playbook to make sure that those exceptions become the new rule where appropriate. Market standards also change frequently as well. So reviewing the playbook annually will allow you to also kind of take stock of what's happening in the market, what trends your team is seeing in contract reviews, and updating the playbook as needed. So both from a company internal risk perspective or risk appetite perspective point, and what's just market standard, you can combine those two. So yeah, that'll help speed up negotiations. All right, so here is where I'm going to go into a bit about how TLB can help. I see we've had a couple other people comment and ask some questions, so I'll first go into those before we go into what TLB does. So I've got a comment here. Would the company intranet be a good place to store the playbook? Could it help the business understand the rationale of the legal team for inserting red lines? Or do you risk giving the business a mechanism for shortcutting any negotiations and agreeing to your weakest position that you will accept? Great questions. And yeah, this is almost like an existential question that we actually go through with a lot of our clients to figure out exactly how mature your business stakeholders are and kind of trustworthy. So we would recommend probably not storing this comprehensive legal user playbook in the company intranet. Instead, you can do kind of an FAQ page for your business stakeholders to tell them, we know that that we always have to negotiate this point. Here's the risk to the business if we just go along with what, your counterparty is asking for. So maybe something more informative and kind of explaining the why behind the red lines rather than just, here's the fallback, here's the response. Just something more, engaging and transparent in what your company can and can't do. I think that might be more helpful than just giving them this overwhelming information set out in the playbook. But with that being said, to kind of your second point around giving or allowing that to be kind of a shortcut for the business to just automatically agree to your fallbacks. So we do create some playbooks for business users. NDAs are a really great one to start off with because they're relatively low risk, relatively easy to understand, and the type of business user playbook that you could create. We give some, notes on drafting, a bit more context behind internal fallbacks, accompanying responses, that sort of thing. But that's a great place to start to see how the business handles working with a playbook, because in our experience, some teams have really enjoyed it. They found business teams are a lot more collaborative with legal. Everything is just kind of more seamless, and there's a lot more transparency and openness and trust between those two. So giving that resource to the business kind of bridges any gaps and any points of friction, really. But it's simple enough and a low risk enough contract where it's easy to just kind of let the business own those moving forward. So we'd recommend doing that first for the business. If that's successful and it's great, then you can move on to doing a kind of a more complex agreement with a business user in mind. but we wouldn't recommend including every single controversial point in those playbooks for the business to negotiate just on their own. I think I mentioned these earlier, but liability, warranties, indemnities, probably don't include those in the playbook, so that they do have to go to the legal team for your insight, input, and drafting, expertise. So yeah, kind of there's some give and take there. Cool, awesome. All right. Any other questions before we get into what TLB does? And obviously I've taken up a lot of your time. We're nearing the end. So if you need to drop, no hard feelings, and we'll send this out afterwards. So I think all set with the questions now. So I will start getting into the nitty-gritty details about how playbooks are created as well from TLB perspective. So in our experience, we spend about 40 to 65 hours creating just one playbook. Again, this depends on the complexity, and this is not going to be for your NDAs, but it is a pretty time-consuming exercise. So you can either do that internally, or if you would like TLB to engage TLB to help create your playbooks, we would just need about 3 hours of your time, a 4 to 5 red line sampling, a list of your approvers, so who will include in those points of escalation columns, and it'll be done and dusted in about 6 weeks. So I've set out kind of our methodology for how we usually create playbooks for our customers. So we'll first start with a tailored discovery session to discuss what contracts require playbooks to optimize your function. So we'll kind of do that initial bit with you, and you can also feel free to bring in other team members, other functions, just so that we're building out a playbook that's going to kind of provide the most use basically for your legal team. Then we're going to create an initial draft based on all the materials that you share. And we'll share that initial draft with you, which will be bespoke to your positions and your desired tone of voice when communicating with counterparties. We'll then give you a chance to review, and you can circulate the draft internally to confirm that all the proposed fallbacks are aligned with internal risk appetites. And then we'll hold a final review call with you to discuss any questions and if there's any changes that need to be made in order to finalize it. And then we'll provide you with the final version, which should be ready for use ASAP. So you can start rolling that out and hopefully saving yourself and your legal team a lot of time in negotiations. And here's all the team. We actually have a few more new joiners this month or next month. So we are expanding. But if you have any questions, anything else that's come to mind since this, or later on after we send the recording, please feel free to reach out to me, Katie at tlb.law, or feel free to reach out to hello@tlb.law if you have any other questions, or want to get started on potentially engaging us to help you start building out your playbooks. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope that was useful. I'll just have a quick check on whether we have any more questions, but I think we are all set. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close this out. Thank you so much and have a great day.